Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here at this great event and this great setting. It's slightly intimidating to get the scores up on the board. Before I've opened my mouth, I know that I'm losing, but I will try and persuade as many as possible to change sides. But let me start by telling you who I am. I am a history teacher who loves knowledge and loves teaching people about the great stories and ideas of the past. And I'm an educator who believes that a rich and rounded education is one that develops the head, the academics, but also the heart, your character, and your hand, the ability to create. And I'm also a father who wants my children to learn to understand the world around them and be taught the best which has been thought and said, but also to become confident, skilled adults with a deep sense of what it is to be a kind, questioning, moral human being. So first of all, in the spirit of knowledge acquisition, which everyone in this room will be excited by, it's important for you to know what project-based learning looks like. Not maybe the prejudices that might be in your mind, or the caricature sometimes portrayed of it, but what it really looks and feels like. So let me introduce you to Karl Marx and Margaret Thatcher. We'll have to decide, Daisy, which of us is which. And these are sculptures, and they are part of GCSE history. We were studying the Cold War in history, and the project is to go in depth about the Cold War and do it in a sufficient way to pass GCSEs in it, but also to find a way and a metaphor for really bringing it alive. So the teacher, the history teachers combined with the art teachers, two subjects coming together, both retaining their subject knowledge and the skills and the expertise, but fusing it into a project that produced these extraordinary outcomes. This was year 9 doing this. Year 9s had never worked with clay before and produced these extraordinary sculptures after much crafting, and did some essays and writing with it, which were also of an extraordinary quality. So that's one project example. Let me give you a couple of others. This is called Words for Wildlife, and this, it's falling apart, it's coming out, they're leaflets. This is a project done with a very low literacy Year 7 group. So they came in with reading ages of about 7 or 8, and what we normally do in schools is drill them to an inch of their lives in order to get them up as rapidly as possible. But they were already so demotivated by having gone through primary, not having acquired the basics, that the teacher thought, well, let's try a project style for this. So she combined with a science teacher and read in detail, they may be the only people to have done so, the Biodiversity Strategy of Newham, a very important document. And they came up with these fact files about different species and a how-to guide, how to build a hedgerow haven, beautifully produced and crafted, how to build a bee butterfly garden, for a real audience. And the real audience was the residents in a particular part of Newham, who are now using these fact files in order to improve the biodiversity of their local area. So these Year 7 students, who had almost been written off at the end of primary school, felt the confidence of having produced something of high quality. And if you looked at this, the scientific knowledge and the literacy, many writing complex sentences for the first time, came alive through this project. The city of Sparta faced a formidable enemy for decades. Far from the cliffs of Sparta, there stood a cave that held a terrifying creature. Every winter, the Pellebore would emerge from the cave to attack Sparta. It had legs that could glide and its eyes could hypnotize people. The inferior people would be paralyzed so the Pellebore could eat them whole. All of the elite Spartan soldiers had faced this nemesis, but all had perished. what do you think, year 7, year 8, year 9? Writing about Greek beliefs, Greek mythology. That's from year 3 at our school. They're writing an in-depth project about Greek beliefs. They produced as well some extraordinary sculptures to go with this writing and storytelling. Another example of a really interesting project outcome. Let me give you just a couple more, because what's important about this is by lifting the ceiling on what children can achieve in these projects, by giving the framework and by rigorously planning it, it's extraordinary what they can do. In my particular subject of history, if you think about the writing about significance in history, a really important concept, it's normally at A level where you start comparing different historians and their views. This is a year 7 piece of writing. Many endeavours have been made attempting to define significance and provide a clear structure to see whether something's worthy of study or not. Every attempt has varied with the opinion of those writing it, but all share mutual features. Christine Counsell, Rob Phillips, to name 2, have tried to define the true meaning of significance. But I will be using Geoffrey Partington's attempt at tackling significance. He suggests to be significant, it requires the following features: importance, profundity, quantity, relevance, and durability. And she goes on. Again, these are 11-year-olds writing through project-based learning in incredibly complex ways about the history that they're studying. And I won't go through all of them, but when we had a production of Oliver recently, students in year 9 produced a, better than West End quality programme, having studied Dickens alongside it, having studied the history of the time, they put together this product of really beautiful work. So these are just a flavour, and it's important to start with what project-based learning really is, because there are a lot of misconceptions about it. Let's just be precise about what it is. It's a series of rigorous and exacting processes, an essential question that drives through the project, a grounding text, a great piece of literature or art, substantial and serious knowledge content, multiple drafts of work, practicing those skills and learning that knowledge so that there's real craftsmanship involved, an end product of value. So we lift students' work out of the exercise book and give them something that transcends the classroom and has value in the world. And an authentic audience where it can be shown, critiqued, and a student can be accountable for it. In terms of delivery, PBL contains lectures and direct instruction, particularly at the beginning. It includes Harkness discussions around an oval table for debate. It includes one-to-one and small group tutorials. It includes critique to ensure rigour. And it draws on the brilliant work of E.D. Hirsch and Daniel Willingham to help shape the way students learn. It's usually 2 subject specialists passionate about their subjects coming together. And I think it's an ideal approach to those who really want to deepen knowledge acquisition. What isn't PBL? What is it not? It isn't about teachers giving up on teaching. It isn't about some fluffy ideas of generic skills. It isn't about saying skills are more important than knowledge. It's not a belief that knowledge doesn't matter because everyone can look things up on the internet. It isn't about putting many subjects together under one mushy topic. It isn't about pretending children are experts when they clearly aren't. And it isn't about making posters or using glitter, although a little bit of glitter always helps a project. So, I hope that Daisy and those in the audience who are thinking about this address not what project-based learning, not what they'd like it to be, but what it really is. In order to win this debate, Daisy and others have to dismantle these pieces of work. You've got to say that these pieces of beautiful work are in fact superficial and meaningless. You've got to justify why applying knowledge and skills at school to create work of value has no place. You've got to justify why a narrow, constrained education where children are treated as novices throughout their time at school is supposed to get the most out of them. That is the challenge for Daisy, and I look forward to the debate.
Thank you, Peter, for opening the challenge so eloquently, and now to dismantle project-based learning. Ms. Daisy Christodoulou.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much. So yeah, as Peter said, it's great to be here this morning in such a lovely venue to talk about project-based learning. We have, I don't want to be rude about the Michaela School, but this is a nicer venue than the previous debate. So I think Peter set up a fantastic debate there, and I'm really glad he set it up, because often I think these debates can be a bit sterile with people talking over each other. And I think from what Peter said there, we'll have a good debate here, and we won't have that problem. And so as a result of that, I think in debates like this, it's good to get the agreement out of the way early on. And I think there are lots of points of agreement between us. So I agree with Peter, I think, about the aims of education. And I think I got your statement right, that you want your pupils to be kind, questioning, moral human beings. And I think that's a lovely definition, and one that I would agree with. I think that the skills that Peter's outlined, such as creativity, problem solving, collaboration, these wonderful pieces of work that the pupils have produced, I think that those skills should be at the heart of our education system. I think the difference in this debate is in how we should achieve such aims. And Peter's put forward a few ideas. He has talked about the cross-curricular project between history and art. He's talked about the authentic audiences. He has also mentioned direct instruction and knowledge acquisition, although I would say not given as many examples of those as of the other methods that he's mentioned. He's also given lots of examples of his pupils' work, which is, of course, as a successful head teacher, is completely within his rights to do. But I have to say, I would like to say, I don't want this to turn into a debate about Peter's School, because if it does, I'll lose. I think Peter's School is great, and I think that I have the utmost respect for him in what he's done there in setting it up. But I do in this debate actually want to focus on the research examples. And we know throughout history that there have been examples of successful project-based schools. But we also know that all the research analysis, that all the evidence of how we think and how we learn, that all of the evidence from systems who have tried to adopt this at scale show that project-based learning is not an effective way of learning. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about that research evidence, and I want to talk about those different methods of achieving the outcomes that Peter and I both agree on. So when it comes to project-based learning, I think what we've heard broadly from Peter is that the best way to prepare pupils for those real-world problems they're going to face in the 21st century is, broadly speaking, to get them to tackle those real-world problems in school as much as is possible. So we heard Peter speak about the authentic audience, about the fact files that actually have a purpose and are helping people in the real world. But I'm going to tell you that the best way to prepare pupils to be able to tackle real-world problems is actually for pupils to spend most of their time doing things that don't look like such problems. Project-based learning confuses ends and means. So I think using projects as ends is great, but using them as means isn't. So there's three main reasons why I think that projects are not the best means of learning. First, learning is not the same as performing. Second, projects don't allow you to get good feedback about how to improve. And Peter spoke about feedback and about multiple drafts, and I think this is a key issue, and a key issue why some of the activities he's outlined won't have those learning effects that he wants for them. And third, projects are not nearly as motivating as some people claim. So those are my three arguments today. So first of all, learning is not the same as performing. I need some water, sorry. So learning is not the same as performing. So it seems obvious that if you want to get good at something, we should do it. So if you want to get pupils to think like scientists, or you want to get them to think like historians, as Peter was saying, getting Year 7 pupils to accelerate ahead and think the way A-level students do, think in that historiographical sense, you would say, well, if we want pupils to do that, let's get them to do that. Let's get them to study sources and construct arguments about them, and look at the historiography, as Peter said. And that seems very plausible. But decades of evidence show that that's the wrong approach, because learning is not the same thing as performing. Learning is defined as a change in long-term memory. And those historians and scientists are able to think like historians and scientists because of the knowledge they have stored in long-term memory. The tasks that they do as historians and scientists are different from the tasks that they did when they were in training and when they were learning. And that's because, in the words of three leading researchers, the practice of a profession is not the same as learning to practice a profession. Experts are experts because of the knowledge and the patterns they have in long-term memory. So if you want to get your pupils to get good at something, you need to spend the time in class building up that knowledge, not practicing projects. And my issue around a lot of projects, and some of the ones that Peter's described, is that they require certain kinds of knowledge, but they don't teach that knowledge. So I think the wildlife project is a good example. It requires that pupils have a lot of scientific knowledge, but I'm not sure that it teaches those things. When pupils come to write up the fact file, the project requires them to know how to spell correctly, to use the complex sentences, to do the illustrations, but I'm not sure that there's time in there to teach those things. And at this point, people often say, well, it won't take long to teach those things. We can build in some of that instruction. We can do, a starter activity on complex sentences. And again, that sounds plausible, but the evidence doesn't back it up, because all of the evidence shows us that adults routinely underestimate the amount of time it will take for pupils to learn something. And they do so because most adults suffer from what is known as expertise-induced blindness. And this means that when you get good at something, you forget the effort and the time and the knowledge it took you to get there. You aren't conscious of the knowledge you depend on in order to be good at it. It takes an awful long time to master some of the skills we take for granted. And this is particularly the case. You might be thinking, well, expertise, isn't that a bit high-flown? People don't have to be experts to do some of these things. But I'm talking here about something that we all consider as straightforward as reading. We're all expert readers. And as a result of that, we often underestimate the knowledge it takes to read what we would consider even the simplest of sentences. So, for example, one of my favourite examples of this, a Guardian headline from a few years ago, NATO in Libya catch-22. Now, a lot of us would read that headline and understand it and instantly get what it's talking about. But pupils will struggle with that because it depends on so much prior knowledge. So that's the problem with projects, I think, that they take that knowledge for granted and they encourage us in our expertise-induced blindness. Now, of course, what this does mean is if you are sure that your pupils have sufficient knowledge to be able to attempt a project, then you can do so. And if you've got mechanisms built in for that, I don't have a problem with the idea of a project week at the end of a school year or a project day at the end of a unit of work. And so that's why I say I'm sure that in plenty of these examples, Peter, that those pupils have had those lessons built in where they're getting that. But what I worry is that some of the things that Peter is saying is not giving enough attention to that direct instruction and to those activities. Herbert Simon, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on decision making, made exactly this point. He said that projects could be useful in a limited sense, but he insisted that they could never be the principal learning mechanism. And John Hattie, one of the world's leading educational researchers, had made this point to explain the fact that inquiry-based learning does very poorly in all the meta-analyses that he's conducted. And he says if you are trying to get pupils to build up sufficient knowledge and understanding and vocabulary, that's the wrong time for inquiry-based learning. So I do agree that there is a role for projects in school, but project-based learning is what worries me. And the idea that pupils can learn everything they need to through projects and through these kind of activities is worrying. And I think what we see from Hattie and Hattie's meta-analyses of this, what I'm talking about here is not a mirage of a problem. It's a real problem that affects people's use of projects in the classroom. And so that quickly brings me on to my second reason why projects can't be the principal mechanism for learning. And that's because projects don't actually give you good feedback about how to improve. And that's because the real world is not a very good learning environment. It's very complex, it's very messy, it's very distracting, and it prevents you from understanding exactly what you need to do to improve. So authentic projects are not actually the best way to learn. A lot of the time, what you need to do is to focus in quite narrowly on one aspect of performance and spend a lot of time improving that. And Anders Ericsson, one of the world experts on experts, has written about this. He calls this type of practice deliberate practice. He says, don't practice with authentic projects. He says, practice with deliberate practice, which isolates your area of weakness. He talks about baseball. He says, better, instead of playing a baseball game, if you want to improve, better to work in a drill situation where a batter working with a dedicated pitcher will have several hundred batting opportunities where his weakness can be systematically explored. So several hundred opportunities all targeting a particular weakness. There's a word for this. Peter's mentioned it. The word is drill. And drill, and I agree with what Peter said at the start when he was talking about the importance of the head and the hand. And we know that a lot of the things that help us in learning practical skills like playing baseball are actually the things that help us in academic subjects. And the mention of drill will obviously then make you think of motivation. Peter's spoken about motivation, about the sort of soulless test prep that a lot of our pupils engage in. I'd agree with that too. I'm not a fan of that. But I think when it comes to motivation, we assume too easily that drill is demotivating. And actually, when we look at the research on motivation, which is complex, we find that drill can actually be very motivating because it gives pupils a sense of success, and success is very motivating. And if authenticity is what it takes to get teens interested, then how does one account for all of the very inauthentic things that lots of teens are interested in? Justin Bieber, Harry Potter, Harry Styles' haircut, which is one of the least authentic things I've ever seen. So I think when we look at the research, what actually, we have to bear in mind the impact of success that is important on getting pupils motivated. So, for example, I've seen pupils who have been switched off by reading apparently motivational real books, really turned on by phonics programs, which encourage pupils, they give pupils that success, that's succeeding at the small components, breaking things down. So to conclude, I agree with Peter, I think, probably about more than many of us thought we would at the start of today. But I do think that if we want pupils to develop the kind of skills Peter is talking about, we have to take deliberate practice and breaking down those projects into smaller chunks much more seriously than anything in Peter's speech has led us to believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. I allowed Daisy to continue a little bit longer because I saw she was on the last page of her speech. But if
I don't mind.
If other speakers could remember just to try and keep to time, we get chucked out at 4 o'clock. We're not running over. Okay, thank you very much, Daisy. To answer Daisy's points, Peter again, thank you.
Well, at the risk of too much agreement here, there's quite a lot of what Daisy said I do agree with. I think the importance, and I think Edie Hirsch and others have done us a great service, the importance of cultural literacy, I echo fully. I mean, as a passionate history teacher, one of my saddest moments was doing one-to-one history tutorial with a student in my first school who, when I asked them who Churchill was, said it was the dog at on the insurance advert at the, that was going on at the time. So, there is a lot of ignorance around, and a lot of students who there is a danger go through school ending up not knowing very much by the time they come out of school. So, and I think the great myth actually perpetuated, I would say, by Daisy, to a certain extent by Catherine, Nick Gibb is a great advocate, is that somehow up and down this country people have given up on knowledge. That there are all these sort of pinko liberals in schools trying to do all this fluffy stuff that really is destroying education. And I haven't met any of this. I have been privileged in the last 15 years to have visited hundreds of schools. And when you go into a classroom at random in these hundreds of schools, I would say 95% of them, the teacher is teaching at the front in a traditional way, and the students are more or less passively listening to the teacher. That is the default position of our education system. To give you another example, I've interviewed hundreds of teachers in the last 5 years for jobs at our school. I've never met a science teacher or a history teacher who doesn't want to impart science knowledge. In fact, when you say to them, can you do project-based learning? They say, well, I'm not going to cover the content. So actually, I don't recognise this picture that's painted of our system. The GCSEs, I mean, Daisy says when she's written about this, oh, it's getting more problem-solving and less not. Actually, I know from the history exam again, a typical question is, name the features of the Amritsar massacre. Total recall of knowledge. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, having some of that, but that's what it is. Our system is constructed to give people the knowledge and then regurgitate it in exams at the end. I don't see this picture in our system at the moment where it's not happening. If you could name 10 schools that are doing project-based learning full on, I'd love to meet them. I'd love to be in a network with them. But I haven't found them yet. So that's the first thing. But I do absolutely agree with the point about cultural literacy. I agree with the point about deliberate practice. In fact, when we started the school, it was one of the key phrases we used, that there is a type of practice that sports people know, that musicians know, that is about refining a particular point, not doing sort of global practice. Totally agree with that. I think the three fundamental problems with Daisy's argument, though, I think, are these. First is confusing the need for knowledge acquisition with one delivery mechanism. The evidence from neuroscience and elsewhere and psychology is simply not there that direct instruction in all circumstances is the best. In fact, the research shows that when you're a novice, you need a lot of direct instruction, but as you get better and more knowledgeable, lots of other methods then come into their own. So yes, there's a point at the beginning, and that's why at the start of a project we do a lot of direct instruction and then move on to other methods. There's a recent study of a school, a very traditional school in America, where the A-level science, the average grade was a B- when they took it in June. They then brought back those same students 3 months later, and the average grade was an F. There wasn't a single student who got the grade that they got 3 months earlier. So my great fear for Daisy's approach and my worry for Michaela is that all this method of direct instruction, which is trying to build up, and I want this, like Daisy does, the working memory, is actually not going to achieve that because it's done in such a formulaic way. The knowledge hasn't come alive. They won't actually remember it once they've taken the exams. So I don't think necessarily this is the right approach. Did you give me a clap there?
That was just your last minute.
Okay, two other quick points. I think it's too narrow a vision of education, what Daisy's proposing, because I think there is teaching of knowledge, but there's teaching of character and other things as well. So let's think about what a rounded education really looks like. I can't tell you the number of teachers who have come for jobs at our school, who've got firsts in maths from Cambridge and 3 A's at A-level, who were unappointable at our school because they hadn't got all those other qualities that we know you need to be a great teacher in terms of empathy, in terms of social skills and all the rest. We've got to teach those as well. Final point. I think it's a slightly depressing vision we're being given here, and it's very unambitious of young people. I think at the same time a young person can acquire the knowledge whilst also being able to apply that knowledge. I don't believe that you've got to be a novice for your entire time at school. If that really is the case, we're saying to the amazing students who produce this, you've got no right to produce this now. You've got to wait until you're a complete expert in it in 10 years' time. I don't believe that.
Thank you, Peter. And now to answer some of Peter's points, Daisy again.
Great. So I'll take a couple of the points Peter made in his speech. I certainly don't think I've ever caricatured teachers in schools as all being pinko liberals. If I had done that, I'd have caricatured myself. I'm not sure people know, I'm actually a member of the Liberal Democrats, who are, I think, own the brands on pinko liberalism. If only schools were full of pinko liberals, it'd be great for me. But to take some of the other points, another point Peter made, name 10 schools doing project-based learning completely. Actually, when I began teaching using a program called Opening Minds, a very popular. It's not. Well, I mean, it definitely says it's project-based learning. I taught it, and it looked like project-based learning to me. It was about teaching projects, and 200 schools were doing that in the UK at the time when I was doing it. So there are schools out there doing project-based learning. I mentioned John Hattie, and John Hattie, when he talked about the studies into how projects and inquiry-based learning are used, it is a very real problem that projects are introduced too soon. This isn't something, a myth I've invented. This is something that all the research bears out again and again. And I've explained to you about why it becomes a problem. It's because of this expertise-induced blindness problem. So when Peter said at the end, you can acquire and apply at the same time. Actually, if I was going to home in on what the central kind of real difference is here between what we're saying, given that there is quite a lot of agreement, actually that point at the end really is key. We can acquire and apply at the same time. I think Peter is really suffering from expertise-induced blindness. I really think that. And I think it's great that he's, mentioning direct instruction and that he thinks it's a good idea. But what I find is that, it's just not enough emphasis and not enough recognition of the time it takes to acquire these skills. And the fact that when pupils are novices, we might not like that. We might wish that you could achieve and get them up to be experts very quickly. But the evidence shows it isn't possible. When it comes to knowledge as well, actually, I'd like to dwell on that. I think, sometimes, again, perhaps I can be caricatured as someone, it's all about knowledge acquisition. But I'd like to think in everything I've written and in what I say, actually, I've been very, very, like to speak quite a lot about the knowing-doing gap. It isn't enough to just know something. I've always been keen to stress that. Let me give you an example. I have never met a pupil who didn't know that a sentence began with a capital letter. Not one. Every pupil I've ever asked that, they know the answer. I've met very many pupils who do not consistently apply that knowledge. So how do we get them to apply that knowledge? Now, I think Peter is telling you, let's do some authentic writing that will get them engaged and inspired and see the audience. I'm telling you, let's do direct instruction. Let's do deliberate practice. The best way to close the knowing-doing gap is through deliberate practice. And let me give you quickly one practical example of how long this kind of practice can take, how effective it can be, and how well people can enjoy it. And if Peter could agree when he comes back that this would be a great thing to do in his school, then we'll definitely have had agreement and we'll have got to a point where there really is no disagreement. But it's a program called Expressive Writing. It's been developed by the American educationalist Siegfried Engelmann. It's a direct instruction program. It's had huge numbers of meta-analyses and research and practice that's been done. And what happens is the program breaks down the mechanics of good writing into tiny, really basic chunks. And you might think they're very simple. You might think that they look quite dull. And maybe to you as an expert in writing, they do look dull. My experience of teaching it is that pupils actually really love it. And they love the feeling of success they get. It begins with really simple things like indenting paragraphs, simple present and past tense verbs. It builds in lots of interleaved practice of all of these things. And only when pupils have mastered enough of these do they move on to writing short and simple sentences, and they move on to more complex sentences, and they move on to paragraphs. So yes, I do agree with Peter that as pupils acquire more and more of this knowledge, they can build up to doing more complex tasks. And in the later lessons, there's much less structured extended writing. But as I say, I haven't seen anything in what Peter said today and in the examples he's given that he's really taking seriously the amount of time it takes to acquire this kind of knowledge and the amount of time it takes to do the deliberate practice. So for me, direct instruction really is the model of the kind of teaching we should be doing. Yes, I think there is a place for projects as well when pupils have acquired that knowledge and have done that deliberate practice, but we can't, as Herbert Simon said, make projects the principal learning mechanism. So to finish, I would say my question for Peter to sum up would be, how do you ensure that pupils learn and practice all the knowledge and skills that projects take for granted? How are you closing that knowing and doing gap? We know that it isn't enough to just, if only it were the case that the things we wanted our pupils to learn were the things that they learnt automatically, then there wouldn't be a problem. So my question here is, will these methods of project-based learning, will they mean that pupils learn the things that Peter and I both agree that we want them to learn? Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Finally, Peter to summarise.
Again, I agree with quite a lot of that. Look, I think the key point is this. I think you haven't yet really, and I think you've been unfair on the products today about the quality and depth of knowledge that's being shown. The writing, which I can show you many more examples of Year 8 students writing extraordinary essays about the French Revolution, but having done it through a project-based learning frame, really is amazing. I mean, I remember one of the first big projects we did, which was on World War I for the 100th anniversary. We did an extraordinary exhibition with someone helping us show how to do a museum and curate it, lots of pieces of art, writing. We built a sort of trench in one of the classrooms, exactly the sort of stuff probably Daisy doesn't like. And as a test, with no revision, none of the revision lessons you'd normally have, the day before that exhibition, we gave these Year 8s a GCSE exam paper on World War I. And because of their motivation, which I think Daisy downplays the motivation of projects of doing something that combines skills and knowledge, they all, without exception, did extraordinarily well. Because they had been so immersed in the project, so invested in it, so willing to learn more than the teacher was handing out to them, because it was so exciting for them, that they did exceptionally well and were really working at Year 11 levels in Year 8. It's really important. Project-based learning, I'm not arguing for being the only method. And at School 21, we've got grammar mastery lessons, we've got maths mastery lessons, we obviously learn synthetic phonics in primary very rigorously, we've got a speaking and oracy curriculum and framework, we've got some quite traditional lessons. But project-based learning is one aspect of a mix that allows the ceiling to be lifted on what students can achieve. So I think it's really important from that point of view. But I want to end where I began, with some products, with some more products. The first comes from a great project designer, someone who has had to combine knowledge, skills and attributes. She's had to produce a product of quality for a genuine and authentic audience. And she's had to take knowledge and apply it. She's, of course, Catherine Burble-Singh, who has created a product called Michaela School. She is one of the great advertisements of project-based learning in her own life. So why, I might ask her, is she denying that same thrill to her students? The second person, of course, is Daisy. This is a project. This is a product. She needed a lot of knowledge there, a lot of knowledge, but she needed a hell of a lot as well, didn't she? She needed to design the structure of this book. She needed to think how to apply the knowledge. She needed to craft it, a key requirement of project-based learning. Multiple drafts, I bet she did. She had an authentic audience. Some of you may have bought it and written reviews of it. So again, Daisy is a huge advocate of project-based learning. And she's done it in her life. What we're asking people to do, project-based learning is not some weird thing. If you design your garden at home, it's project-based learning. If you've written a song in your life, it's project-based learning. It's what we do. It's what we do in our life. And I don't believe we can't do that in school because they're not ready, because they're novices, because they haven't been steeped in the knowledge yet. They can do it at school. They can produce beautiful work. This debate is one of the products that we give to our students at the end of a project. What did this debate require with me and Daisy? It required knowledge. I swatted up. I read her book. I read E.D. Hirsch. I gained the knowledge. And also that knowledge, and don't underestimate it, some knowledge is what people call just-in-time knowledge. Some of the knowledge I swatted up for a particular event, which project-based learning helps you with. That is actually quite important. But what else did we bring to it? I brought lots of different skills. Emotional skill, I'm reading the audience. Are you bored by what I'm saying? Are you engaged by what I'm saying? Those are important skills as well as the knowledge. I look at the physical aspect. I'm waving my hands. I always do that too much. But I think it's because it helps attract people to what I'm saying, okay? The physical aspect. Cognitive. I've tried to make an argument. I didn't just have the knowledge. I tried to make an argument. Linguistic. That's a big strand. I tried to use language that was interesting. All of these things go into a project and a product. So what I would like to do is just finish, I think appropriately, Daisy, with a quote from E.D. Hirsch, which we might be able to agree on. He describes, summing up, what we need is lively teaching techniques which motivate students and enhance their active participation in learning with a broad spectrum of knowledge. That is as good a definition of project-based learning as I've ever heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And finally, to summarise for her side, #no1. Daisy.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So, yeah, and it has. I said at the start, I think this would be a better debate than a lot of these debates normally are, and I think that's been true. I think we've really got to the heart of the issue. And I think as a result of that, there are things we can certainly agree on. I think we both agree that using more than one technique in the classroom can be a good thing. Peter's accepted, and not just accepted, it's celebrated the idea of direct instruction, of grammar mastery, of those kinds of progress, of those kind of techniques. I've said absolutely that projects can be a good thing once people have the requisite background knowledge in place. And you've heard from me as well about closing that knowing-doing gap and the value of deliberate practice in that. And again, the quotation from Hirsch at the end I would agree with, and all the things Peter said about cultural literacy. But where has the disagreement been? And I think there is a disagreement here. And I think actually a large part of what Peter said in the first part of his summary really summed it up. When he was talking about Catherine and the amazing projects Catherine has run, and that she's a great advert for project-based learning, that fundamentally goes to the heart of what I spoke about in my speech, which is first of all that performance isn't learning. It's a very easy mistake to make, to think that performance is learning, but it isn't. Learning is a change in long-term memory. So when I look at these wonderful products, yes, they're wonderful products, but we know from all of the research on this that pupils can produce wonderful products. I'm not saying it's the case here, but that it is possible to produce a wonderful product, but the learning is about the change in long-term memory, is about building the schemas in long-term memory. And I think Peter consistently has confused learning and performance again and again and again. And I think he did that when he was referring to Catherine and the great project she's done, and that leads on to the second thing where I think the disagreement is, which is this novice expert problem. And novices aren't experts. And we might love it if they were, and we might wish that they were. And Peter has asserted that pupils can tackle the projects that experts do, but actually all the evidence we have is that they can't. That experts think not just in a quantitatively different way to novices, but in a qualitatively different way. And again, the simplest way of thinking about this is thinking about reading. That when you read, you just don't even think about all of the knowledge and all of the background, all the vocabulary that you bring to bear on it. But if you don't have those things, you're absolutely stymied. And we don't realise it because we are experts. So it's that expertise-induced blindness. And as a result of that, I think that means Peter has consistently underestimated the time that we need to spend on making sure pupils have that background knowledge. And I think this goes to the heart of one of the things we're learning more and more about human learning processes over the last few decades. And we know that we are subject, adults and pupils, to all kinds of cognitive biases in this subject. So adults, as I've said, have the problem of expertise-induced blindness. Pupils have a similar and related one, that they confuse familiarity with understanding. They see something they vaguely remember studying and assume they completely understand it. And my problem is that project-based learning of the type Peter's been outlining, rather than countering our inbuilt natural cognitive biases, they encourage us to indulge them. They encourage us to indulge our most misleading instincts. They encourage us to confuse novices and experts. They encourage us, therefore, to skate over vital content, not to give it the time that it deserves. I haven't talked here about overlearning, which is the idea that even when you can produce a brilliant product, there's still value in practicing and doing that deliberate practice. They encourage us, their projects, I think, to underlearn instead of overlearn. They encourage us to assume as innate, I think, that which is actually learnt. Whereas lessons which are organised much more around the deliberate practice work against these biases. They force us to think more closely about what the pupil's weaknesses are and how they can improve them. And as I say, that deliberate practice, sometimes when you speak about it, perhaps it can sound as though it isn't motivating. And we've talked about the motivational factor too. But as I say, I would counter sort of, the wonderful product Peter has produced with the sense of joy and satisfaction I have seen so many pupils get who have struggled with reading and struggled with writing, who when they come through projects like the Ruth Miskin Read Writing Phonics programme or Engelman's Expressive Writing programme, which I've discussed, that when they come through those, which to the outside eye can often look perhaps quite bitty and quite disconnected, but when the pupils come through those and get that feeling of success, and all of a sudden they are reliably using the capital letter at the start of every sentence, and they are reliably using subordinate clauses correctly, that then the confidence that gives them and the motivation they feel from that. And as well as that, I think even in the kinds of things, it's not just the reading and the writing where it can help. Even with more advanced things, it can help. It wouldn't be a speech by me at Macaulay debate if I didn't mention Shakespeare's education. But we know that Shakespeare, one of the most creative minds of all time, who created great projects, as Peter was saying, with the project of writing a book. Well, Shakespeare's plays are sort of unparalleled in their creativity. But we know from his education that it had zero project-based learning. And it was absolutely all about that deliberate practice. And we can trace that impact of that deliberate practice in figures of speech throughout his work. So to sum up here, I think the fundamental differences between us have been this idea that performance and learning, I think Peter's conflated them, and I think Peter, expert that he is suffering from a case of expertise-induced blindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy and Peter, for what was a genuinely thrilling debate. I really enjoyed that. There are now about 20 minutes in which we can ask for questions from the audience. If you can make it clear to whom your question is directed and keep it short and sweet, that would be lovely. Microphones will be circulating, so I'll just pick someone and then the microphone will make its way to you. We start with this lady in the middle here. Oh, can you wait for the microphone? We want to record your thoughts.
Could I just ask if your research for this talk extended to going and visiting Michaela's school? Because when I visited in February as a teacher and a parent, I was really blown away. And the children were so happy with the school. There was nothing depressing about the school at all.
Okay, was that a question?
I wanted to ask Peter if he'd actually visited Michaela's school, as I have.
Okay.
No, well, I haven't made any comments about Michaela's school. But no, I haven't visited, and Daisy hasn't yet. Daisy hasn't yet visited School 21, and we're going to hopefully exchange visits. Nothing I've said today was about Michaela's school, particularly.
I thought you did say that the method sounded, that the view of education seemed depressing. That's what.
I think we can follow that up in a little while. Thank you very much indeed. Can I have a question from this gentleman here, please? Thank you.
Hi. So, a question for Peter. My wife and I dread weekends when my son gets projects for homework because we know we're going to end up spending the whole weekend on it with him, possibly end up filling that A3 piece of paper ourselves because he hasn't got the skills or knowledge to do it. So the question for you is the reality of project-based learning for most children closer to my son's experience than to what's going on in your school?
Yep, don't set it for homework.
I'm loving this. Another question. That gentleman there, please.
Thanks. Hi, this is a question for Daisy. Daisy, I'd like to challenge you on a point that Peter made, and you didn't address it at all, which is the benefits of cross-fertilisation from a cross-faculty perspective. And Peter made a number of really good examples. In my school, I could see where there'd be massive benefits of that happening. And you haven't talked about that at all.
Yeah, so I absolutely have a response to that. I just ran out of time. It's a working memory issue. So the problem with when you try and do cross-curricular projects is that all of us have limited working memories. You can't increase working memory. The only way you short-circuit the limitations of working memory is building up long-term memory. So the problem with cross-curricular projects is that they require you to focus on too many things at once. So the problem is, what is it? You can never be certain what pupils are thinking about at that moment in time. So I take an example from Dan Willingham, who Peter mentioned and praised. Willingham always talks about, I'll take another example from an Ofsted report, a cross-curricular project in, I think, English and crafts, where pupils made made puppets of Romeo and Juliet, and it was a cross-curricular project. Now the problem here is, and Willingham talks about this, is that learning is defined as a change in long-term memory. So if you want to learn something, you need to get it into long-term memory. How do we get it into long-term memory? Well, working memory is a bottleneck, so it has to go through that bottleneck. And then in order to remember something, i.e. for the learning to happen, we have to think about something. And the problem is, in confusing environments where there's lots of things going on at once, it's hard to keep the focus on the one thing. And that's a particular issue, again, for novices, but it's a problem for all of us. So the problem, if you like, with the Romeo and Juliet puppets lesson is what is it that pupils are thinking about? Now, if they're thinking about making the puppet, that's fantastic. And that's really good. That will help them build the puppet and make the puppet. But does that help them learn about Romeo and Juliet is the issue. Because their thought is not being directed there. So the problem with cross-curricular projects is, given all that we know about the central importance of attention in learning, how can you be sure where pupils' attention is? So that is a fundamental problem with those kind of cross-curricular projects.
Can I just come back on that? Yeah. Because I think what's deeply depressing in this argument is how much you're using neuroscience and research, and I think distorting it, to then reduce the potential of what students can achieve. It's just not true what you're saying. It might be true if you take a literal meaning of what some of the research has said. It's not true actually in practice. So what happens, let's take, instead of a puppet, let's take these. I mean, but a puppet could be identical. It's not beyond us, and wasn't in this project, to have two teachers coming together, a history teacher and an art teacher. The history teacher has segments within the project where they are only, and this is crucial, Daisy, they are only focusing on the history, and they are getting in-depth knowledge on the history. They are then focusing on making this, learning the skills. They'd never worked with clay before, the students who did this, working on how you work on clay. And actually there's a lot of sophistication, because this isn't just Karl Marx, this is meant to be a caricature, so they looked at caricature and the history of caricature and all the rest of it. So there was actually quite a lot of depth in different ways behind this. But they were segmented, and it's not beyond us. So I completely agree. Willingham says that what you learn is what you're thinking about. That's absolutely right. But when they're thinking about the clay model, they're learning about the clay model. When they're thinking about the history, they're learning about the history. And more than that, the neuroscience shows that interleaving, which means the effort of going from one type of learning to another or one type of subject to another reinforces the learning, because all learning that goes in, it has happened because it's effortful. So the neuroscience actually backs this up. It's being distorted in a way that isn't very helpful by Daisy.
Can I come back? Because it was a question to me.
Hang on a sec. I get the feeling this is a real point of tension that you guys want to hear more about. I'm going to limit it to one more response from Daisy, and then we're going to move on to the next question. So,
first of all, it's deeply depressing that I want to limit people's potential. That's absolutely not the case. And I've said all along that my aims here are the same as Peter's. It's a debate about methods. So, absolutely, it's all about, I've mentioned Shakespeare at the end. I would love for all our pupils to be as creative as Shakespeare. That's what the aim is. When it comes to methods, I am really glad to hear Peter say that they have a section on the history and a section on the sculpture. And I think that is key. And too much of the other things I read about projects don't make that distinction. So I'm really glad to hear Peter saying that. It is true, because if you look again at the meta-analyses and the research on this, John Hattie, who has
tried to... It's not about the analysis, it's about what's going on. No, let's have a debate about this.
But you just had a debate.
No, it's important.
Can I finish?
No, can I just say... Let me say one thing.
Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you. Daisy's speaking. Thank you.
May I finish, Peter? Yeah. Okay. So when you look at the meta-analyses on this, it is a very real problem that people start projects too soon. That's not me saying that. That's John Hattie, one of the leading educational researchers in the world, trying to explain why project-based learning doesn't have the outcomes that we all think it should have. People introduce it too soon. Peter, I'm really glad, I think it's a great thing that you are doing the separate bits first. I think that will make the project more successful. That's what I've said all along. So on this, I think potentially we're agreeing. As long as you get the knowledge in first and the pupils have got that, great, go for it. I think then potentially the point of tension is how much time it takes for that. But it is a real problem. This is not a problem I've invented. It is a problem with project-based learning and all the research everywhere, that it's introduced too soon.
Yeah, but the research isn't really addressing project-based learning as it can be.
Okay,
and no, but this is an important point of agreement.
Okay.
If project-based learning is done well, Daisy's saying, it's actually fine. What she's saying is, which I agree with, is there's a lot of bad project-based learning, but there's a big admission, and it's really important.
Yeah, what I'm saying is if project-based... I have to come back to this. If project-based learning is done well, often it doesn't look like project-based learning.
Okay, right.
Because you introduce the first bits first, and it's not a project anymore.
Stop. Okay, thank you. Right, we've got a serious tension in the nature of the cross-curricular. This could go on for a while. Please raise your hands if you would like this to continue.
I think we've got to...
Right, okay, not enough people. Okay, so we'll go to the next question. Can I have a question from the gentleman at the back, please?
Peter, what I'm hearing from a lot of your argument is that you want to do everything that Daisy's saying and more. But we don't live in a world of infinite time and infinite resources. So if you consider the type of school that Daisy's advocating for, what are the things from that school that you would not do in order to free up the time and the resources for the approach that you are advocating?
I actually think you can combine the two, because I think my argument is that if you get project-based learning right, then you get a greater depth of knowledge and a faster acquisition of knowledge, because you've got increased motivation from the students. They can see what the application of that knowledge is going to be, and therefore they're more inclined, I think, more inclined to learn that knowledge. So it's not necessarily about training up. I think you could do fewer things better. So there's a big debate which we could open up about depth v breadth, and we might have slightly different emphases on that. But I'm saying as part of a mix, I've just said what we do at School 21 is not exclusively project-based learning, but as part of the mix of a school, getting students, whilst they're at school, to create work of real value, given that the world that they're going to go into, and this question of the question today is it preparing children for the 21st century? If all we're doing in school is filling them up with knowledge without giving them the chance to apply it, then I think we're missing on something really important. And I go back to the number of graduates that I see looking for jobs who have been told throughout their academic career that they're top of the top, they went to a top private school, got their 3 A's, got a first at Oxford or Cambridge, but have no way of applying that knowledge in the world that they're then entering. That is the problem, and I think we can combine the two.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for Daisy? That lady there, please.
Hi Daisy. I'm a maths teacher, and in my adult life I love maths and I love problem solving. As a student, I got an A star at GCSE and A level. I thought I was taught quite traditionally.
Yeah.
I was good at memorising, following procedures. But at 18, I chose not to study mathematics because I wasn't interested in it. I had no idea what mathematicians did. What was missing from my education that would have inspired in me a love of mathematics?
So, absolutely. I think I'm not, as I've said all along, I think there's a role for projects and there's a role for, potentially, looking at what it is that experts do and looking at it is that what mathematicians do so people can see what that is. It seems to me to be good career guidance as much as anything. I think the issue I've tried to get across here is just about this, about what the best method and the best means of learning is. And I think if we try to teach pupils by getting them to just copy what experts do, that won't make them experts. So trying to get pupils to think like mathematicians is not an effective way, actually, to get them to think like mathematicians.
Thank you, Daisy. Can we take a question from that gentleman over there, please?
When I think about project work I did, I think I was always asked to start it before I was taught enough. But I do think there is a role for it. Would the two of you consider coming together and writing a book on how you might bring those two together?
Daisy first, then
Okay.
Peter.
Yeah. Coming together to write a book. Yeah. Why not, Peter? Why not?
I volunteer my services.
Yeah.
It's arbitration.
I think what you say about pupils, being asked to do it too soon is very true and is really the central point I think I've been trying to make. And I think actually, potentially, Peter spoke, what's the fastest way of acquiring knowledge? Actually, all the evidence shows the fastest way of acquiring knowledge, the most efficient way is through direct instruction. And there's been, as I say, numerous examples on this. I spoke about expressive writing, the direct instruction programme. So arguably, maybe we should come together and write a book. If we could do the expressive writing, the direct instruction, and get pupils, up to speed as quickly as possible on those things, maybe we can move on to the advanced projects sooner. Who knows?
Do you have any thoughts?
Well, no. Well, I'd certainly love to write a book with Daisy. That's certainly true. Look, there are two extremes in this debate, and hopefully we've both showed that we're somewhere in the middle. One extreme is to say you don't need any knowledge anymore because it's all on the internet and you just Google everything and get it. And there's some people who believe that. I don't believe that at all, but that's one extreme. The other is to think you have a schooling which is just about having children sitting there in rows being given the information that they need to have, and all will be well. And I think what we're both saying is you've got to have a very rich mix in a school. You've got to give them the basics, whether it's the literacy basics or the numeracy. You've got to give them a lot of foundation knowledge. But actually, students are incredibly skilled and clever. I mean, the cliche is they're sponges. They are. They will acquire a lot of different types of skills, knowledge, and attributes, and they are better than I think Daisy's giving credit for at putting them together in fantastic ways that really help their learning. And it is learning by doing is a type of learning. Learning by direct instruction rather than learning by doing. Look, there is a place for direct instruction, but you do gain something else by learning by doing. And I think this performance point that you were accusing me of, I don't think is fair. When Catherine sets up a school, she's got a lot of knowledge about teaching in advance that she's built up. But she's also, if she's like me setting up the school, learning by doing on things that probably she didn't have experience on, like how to build a school building. I didn't know anything about that. And you learn through doing. It's not that she needed to go away for 2 years and swat up on architecture, and only then could she come back and build her school building. You actually learn on the job. So I'm saying there's a value in both those things, foundation learning, but also learning by doing. And I think that's a common ground, hopefully, between us.
Okay. We've got time for one more question. Can we have a question from this gentleman here, please?
Thanks. Question maybe more for Peter. The analogy that strikes me most personally with regard to this particular debate between project-based and direct learning is that of sport. And there's no professional athlete or professional sports team that I can think of that trains for their sport by performing. There's no football team that just goes on the training ground and plays football matches over and over again. No Olympic sprinter just runs 100 meters over and over again. No boxer just gets in a boxing ring and just boxes to prepare for a boxing match. They practice the granular sort of sub-components of the aggregate skill in order to be able to perform when the time comes to perform. And yes, when they perform, they'll develop stuff that they weren't able to practice when they're on the training ground. But the majority of the development comes on the training ground, practicing those micro-level skills. My question to you is that an accurate analogy? If not, why not?
Yeah. It's a very good analogy, and I totally agree with it. It is that combination of deliberate practice and learning through doing. So I think in how you put it to me, you probably slightly underestimate that learning by performing on that football field and in the heat of the battle, learning that actually the things that you've done in deliberate practice, like how you've got your back four in line, actually crumples when you've got someone running towards you at high pace and all the rest of it. So the doing through learning is crucial, and don't underestimate that, but the deliberate practice in any sport or area of music is also important, which is why we've got one of our history teachers from School 21 here as well. You could ask her afterwards how she does it in her project-based learning lessons. But she's doing a lot of deliberate practice. She's having tutorials, and incidentally, just at a small sort of teaching point, if you've got 25 in a class and you're doing direct instruction, you give them far less personal attention. If you set up your class in more workshop style for project-based learning, what we're finding is you're giving that one-to-one tutorial or the one-to-two tutorial on their essays, which is getting really forensic and getting them to do deliberate practice. So actually there is which we haven't really got into today, a pedagogy around project-based learning that really aids the forensic in a way that direct instruction in a large class simply doesn't. You're not giving that personal attention. So it's both. So it's a very good analogy, and it's both of those things.
Yeah, I'm really glad someone mentioned sport, because I didn't mention my speech, but it's a great analogy. And it is absolutely true when you look at sportsmen, they practice with the drill all the time. You look at the Barcelona Football Academy, they're not playing 11-a-side matches. In Spain, in Germany, and all the countries that are much better than us at football, they delay the 11-a-sides until much, much later. The problem with us, we introduce the 11-a-side match too soon, which gives the incentive to strength and speed, which actually you want to be focusing on. If you decompose football, decompose it into its constituent parts, what is it? Bill Shankly said it, if you cannot give and take a pass, you cannot play. So it's about the pass, and that's why, you know, Barcelona's La Masia Academy, it's all about the pass. It's just, you know, drilling on the pass all the time. So that is vital. And I would say, you know, definitely an analogy there for teaching. And from my own experience, I am a keen footballer, I'm a keen runner as well. And just to go back to that point about how things that don't look like the final product can help you improve, I was really sceptical of the idea that yoga would help you get better at football or at running. And it has. So if you take one thing away from today, yoga, you know, it's not as bad as it seems.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. And Daisy, can a round of applause, please?